Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm sure that I can speak for both Professor Lüdemann and myself when I say how delighted we are that so many of you have come out this evening to join with us in discussing the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. But a warning is in order. To many of you who have never studied the New Testament, the discussion this evening may at times be technical and difficult. For Professor Lüdemann and I are going to be approaching the New Testament not as an inspired holy book, but rather as what it originally was, namely a collection of ancient documents. What you're going to hear tonight is a debate between two historians concerning the reliability of a collection of ancient texts concerning one particular event, the resurrection of Jesus. If the discussion threatens to get too technical, then I may simply refer you to the further discussion in our book. But we'll also be talking about philosophy of history, because Professor Lüdemann and I differ profoundly on what kinds of historical hypotheses are permissible as live options. And this is critical for a discussion of Jesus' resurrection. Now, in order to focus our discussion this evening, I propose to defend two basic contentions in tonight's debate. Number one, that any adequate historical hypothesis concerning Jesus' fate must explain four facts accepted by the majority of New Testament scholars, namely Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. And number two, the best explanation of these facts is the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. So let's look at that first contention together. I want to share with you four facts which are widely accepted by New Testament scholars today. Fact number one, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. This fact is highly significant because it means that the location of Jesus' tomb was known in Jerusalem. In that case, the disciples could never have proclaimed his resurrection in the face of an occupied tomb. New Testament historians have established this first fact on the basis of the following evidence. Number one, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old information handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Number two, the burial is part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Three, as a member of the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. Four, Mark's burial account is simple and lacks traces of legendary development. And five, no other competing burial story exists. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. And in our last debate, Dr. Ludemann stated that he and I are largely in agreement about this first fact. Now, this isn't surprising since, in the words of the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is, quote, one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus, end quote. Fact number two, on the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. Number one, the empty tomb story is also part of that very old source material used by Mark. Two, the old information transmitted by Paul in 1 Corinthians implies the fact of the empty tomb. Three, Mark's account of the discovery of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. Four, the fact that women's testimony was worthless in first century Palestine counts in favor of the women's role in discovering the empty tomb. For any later legendary account would almost certainly have made male disciples to have discovered the empty tomb. And number 5, the earliest Jewish allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body itself shows that the body was in fact missing from the tomb. Now, I could go on, but I think that probably enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Dr. Ludemann, however, denies the fact of the empty tomb. Why? Well, his skepticism on this account is based upon 3 assumptions, which strike me at least as very dubious. First, he assumes that the only primary source we have for the empty tomb is Mark's gospel. But this is almost certainly mistaken. Matthew and John have independent sources for the empty tomb account. It's also mentioned in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles, and it's implied by Paul. To quote the biblical critic Klaus Berger, the reports about the empty tomb are related by all 4 Gospels and other writings of early Christianity in a form independent of one another. We have a great abundance of reports which have been separately handed down. Thus, we have multiple independent attestation to the fact of the empty tomb. Secondly, Dr. Ludemann assumes that when Jesus was arrested, the disciples fled back to Galilee, and so could not have visited the tomb. But this is a hypothesis which the historian Hans von Campenhausen rightly dismisses as a scholarly fiction. Not only is there absolutely no evidence for this assumption, but it's inherently implausible. I mean, can you imagine the disciples fleeing from the Garden of Gethsemane, grabbing their things, and not stopping until they got all the way back to Galilee? It's just inherently implausible. Moreover, Dr. Ludemann's own theory contradicts this assumption, for it's crucial for his theory that at least Peter remained in Jerusalem, where he denied Jesus. So at least Peter could have visited the tomb of Jesus. Finally, third, Dr. Ludemann assumes that the Jewish authorities suffered a sort of collective amnesia about what they did with the body of Jesus. Even if Joseph or the Jews only gave Jesus a dishonorable burial, why didn't they point to his burial place as the quickest and easiest answer to the disciples' proclamation that Jesus was risen from the dead? Dr. Ludemann admits, and I quote, "Jews showed an interest in where Jesus' corpse had been put, and of course a proclamation of Jesus as the risen one provoked questions about his body from opponents or unbelievers," end quote. So why, when the disciples began to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus, didn't the Jewish authorities say where they had put Jesus' body? Dr. Ludemann's answer: they forgot. Well, I think this might strike many of us as somewhat less than convincing, to put it mildly. I mean, can you imagine the Sanhedrin gathered together behind closed doors, racking their brains? What did we do with the body? Where did we put it? Caiaphas stands up and says, "Shmuel, you were there. Where did we put it? Tell us." "I don't know. You ask me. I can't even remember where I parked my camel when I come to the temple." Seriously, though, I think this is a hypothesis of desperation. And thus it seems to me that we not only have good positive reasons for accepting Jesus' empty tomb, but that Dr. Ludemann's reasons for denying this fact aren't very persuasive. Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is almost universally acknowledged among New Testament critics for the following reasons. First, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, guarantees that such appearances occurred. These included appearances to Peter, the 12 disciples, the 500 brethren, and James, the younger brother of Jesus. And secondly, the appearance traditions in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of these appearances. Dr. Ludemann himself concludes, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." Finally, fact number 4. The original